So I'm Jess Huon, and the tradition that I practice within, and I also do practice within other traditions, but the kind of home camp tradition is the Insight tradition. And I've been teaching in this tradition for the last 15 years. And it's the Insight tradition, which is in this lineage a slightly westernized version of the Theravadan tradition. And that comes through Christopher Titmuss, who spent a lot of time in Thailand. And then I practiced a lot with him in India originally. Yeah, and so there's a lot of Australian teachers in the Insight tradition that have come through the lineage of Christopher Titmuss. Yeah, like some of you would know, like Patrick Kearney and Carol Perry and Sabana. Yeah. Well, I would say that the meditation and the contemplative practice is it really is at the heart of the Insight tradition. In many ways, it's a bare-boned tradition where a lot has been stripped back to really focus on the meditative practices, and that the mindfulness or meditation, it's also situated within a very big body of teachings, like you could say quite a comprehensive map of teaching, which is demonstrated in the Eightfold Path that probably many of you have heard about. And you could say that the Eightfold Path, with which the meditation arises out of, could be divided into three components. I like to think about it like that. You've got the ethical component, so a training in ethics and intention as to why we would even engage in a meditation practice. And we could talk about more of that later, fill that out. And then the central one is meditation practices and contemplative practices, of which mindfulness is part of, to begin to help us to know what it is to really settle the mind. You could call them almost calm abiding practices, where we're learning how to deepen into other modes of being, how to settle the mind, how to start to wake up our attention to be able to just to start to see what's going on in our own experience. And then the third component, once we've settled into meditation and got some deeper ground and some freshness in the way that we're looking at things, opportunity for liberating insight to arise, to have insights into our experience that can really free things up and lessen suffering. Yeah. Well, as I said again, I think that the liberating insight originally, so that is founded, as I was sort of saying, on an ethical orientation of wanting to live or practice in a way that lessens suffering, you could say, and not only lessens suffering, but is regenerative, that enhances our own life and supports a thriving of our own mind and body, and also supports that in all others. So there's the ethical thing that we're practicing, not just for ourselves, but for everybody else, yeah, which I would say is a high growth movement as an individual to mature in our capacity to hold more people in our field of awareness and care. And then so resting on that ethics is the calm abiding, learning how just to settle down, how to settle the mind, to have space to see what's happening for this liberating insight. And you're saying, how does liberating insight, your question was to support the growth in an individual? Well, then when we're starting to see the patterns in our own mind that cause us suffering, we are learning to work with that in a really skillful way, to look at the patterns of mind of self-harassment, to look at the patterns of worry in the mind, to look at where we're disconnected, to look at where, to be able to start to see in this and to find some freedom that we don't need to be hamstrung by this is sort of very powerful, to also start to grow this capacity to have an inner sort of resource where we're not being so reactive to our experience internally and also to others. Yeah, I'd say that's grows a powerful resource in our development. And then the liberating insight to be able to handle the inevitable changes of our life with some, again, resourcefulness to be able to have the ground to handle transitions in our life, to not just cling to what we know, to be able to handle change, the regenerative nature of change and the painful nature of change, inevitably losing people that we love. Is that such a big question in a way, to understand fundamentally sort of impermanence, to be able to enjoy, you could just say even the aging process, that life changes. These are sort of powerful things. I think also liberating insight to be able to start to see what's a trustworthy what's a trustworthy pursuits for my life and what's not so trustworthy internally, like what patterns in my mind, what internal voices are worth listening to, and what's not worth listening to, what's denigrating inside and what's growthful inside. Within that, we kind of find an independence of spirit to start to be able to not just be under the thumb of our thinking process, but have some space to start to look. And so enormous creativity can be released in that, the freedom to respond to what's happening, not to be reactive. Then you could apply that to the political sphere, to have an independence in thinking. Should I believe that? Should I not believe that? So there is a kind of also discerning that we grow, what leads to suffering and what compounds suffering. You could say all insight is kind of following on from that question. How can I liberate suffering rather than compound it, and then make choices that line up with that, how we relate to ourselves and how we relate to others. The independence of spirit to really question and think critically about what is regenerative for life and what denigrates sort of life, to put in one simple kind of way, and then to grow the calm in the face of all that we weather, to have creative responses rather than knee-jerk reactive responses that we just see so much, don't we, that get us in trouble. To find that inner freshness inside of responsiveness rather than reaction, I think is such a pivotal thing. And then, in more in an enchanted way further along, to start to know ourselves as something quite different than maybe we had perceived, to know ourselves as not as such a confined, constrained individual, but with a lot more capacity and range and change, just in even who we are, to not be so identified to ourselves as being one thing. The teachings, they can begin in a very sort of pragmatic way that we understand, but where they will take us is something else, we could say, in terms of liberating insight actually into who we are, our place in existence, our interdependence with everything else. It's wanting to put us, that insight, into a deep context of belonging to life. Yeah, so that's the far reach. There's a big range there of developmental growth in a practice. Yeah, from just feeling more calm, thinking more creatively, having more independence, then to a radical interrogation of actually who we are. As I was mentioning, it's a very comprehensive map that this insight tradition, that's, of course, the Buddha Dharma of that eightfold path. So there's a lot of different practices. There's a lot of different qualities to come into play to support the fruition of our own mind. Or we could say, the wholeness or the integration of our own being. So there's not just one, but to say just a few, is say for a daily practice, as I've kind of been articulating, first, like an inquiry into ethics, into why am I doing this? What is this for? What am I cultivating? How can I, to question, how can I live in a way where I'm not causing more harm where I am growing a regard and a sensitivity to the subjectivity of others around me. That's just internal inquiry. And then there's the practices, say calm abiding practices, where I'm learning to settle my mind. So that could be focusing on the breath, using an object to place our awareness on to help settle the mind. It's very helpful to be able to do that to support what I mentioned before as a growth factor, to be less reactive, to have a deeper reference point in our being that isn't just in the thinking mind, a place to return to. It's sometimes said that the following the breath for a long time will be like, we don't just follow the breath just to follow the breath. You're following the breath because where it will lead you, it can lead you, the Buddha would say, into an island of peace. So a freedom in us to respond. So that would be a practice. Then I would be saying we would engage in other practices, more insight practices, where we start to bring in other parts of our human experience. So I mentioned the breath, then we might bring in the body and bring in sensations and bring in working with emotions. Then working with what we could sometimes call the hindrances in the mind, what comes into the mind that dampens our attention, that darkens our attention, that brings a heaviness to our human experience, to start to come into a relationship with all of this in the purpose for freedom, to know that we don't have to unconsciously be ruled by these processes inside that we haven't yet been able to have a handle on or clear eyes on. Yeah, so you'd start with the breath, and then we'd start to look into emotions, and we'd start to sort of kind of understand a little bit more of the impermanent nature of our emotions. We'd start to find a reference point that's not just in what's passing, but somewhere deeper to look upon and work skillfully with what's happening in us. We would offer practices also around loving kindness. So how can we really start to bring and cultivate inner warmth, care and compassion internally, which has to be the ground for that growing wider. If we don't attend to with kindness and care to our own minds, to our own hearts, then sometimes we're on a kind of self-sacrificial movement of compassion that burns up. So we need to cultivate care inside, and then with that very strong ground, start to broadening that to those around us. There's lots of practices to support that, like the Brahma Viharas. So we have a whole range of heart-based practices to grow other qualities that enhance our life, like joy, like equanimity, loving kindness and compassion. You could also in time start to grow practices which is more on the calm abiding. I mentioned the breath, coming to that island of peace, but they can even go a lot deeper. I said there's a pragmatic kind of understanding of these teachings, and then they also go into a whole other realm of human depth and possibility, which I find really compelling, such as practices to really know what it is to feel deep, deep ease and pleasure and inner richness in our own body and heart and mind, and the jhana practices. So it's also sometimes we do originally need to find a lot of foundation in practice, like the breath, the calm abiding, just to settle, to feel okay, to not be in a state of alarm. So we really can foster fresh, inventive thinking. So, and in those calm abiding practices, to know what an inner richness or inner pleasure means, to be able to feel that in our bodies. That's where some of the teachings want to take us. And that is an amazing resource to have in a culture that is bent on consumerism and manipulation of feeling not enough, that you have to do more, that you need this, that you need that you need to maybe, power over to get a sense of self. When we can start to feel the inner richness that comes through working with your own breath, your sensations, your body, it's quite counterculture. And it's a wonderful independence of being and well-being that these practices we can cultivate that take a lot of time. Well, I think it's a if you are practicing within this tradition diligently, passionately, in a sustained way over time, I feel that is an inevitable outcome, because you're practicing to deepen your capacity for what I said, metta, loving kindness, compassion, karuna, I'm using the Pali words, the language spoken at the time of the Buddha, joy, mudita, equanimity, steadiness. As we start to practice and start to relate with ourself and bring the care and the interest, and also start to just sort of move beyond some of what constricts us, some of what holds us back, everything that keeps us dampened down, or agitated or restless, and we start to find more energy for our life, inevitably we will start to be more available for those around us and for the concerns around us. And there's a refinement in our care. So in a way, it's a natural thing. And in the tradition, what I was always loving is it's quite some of the teachers that I've had have been quite political, like Christopher Titmuss. A lot of work in the political arena and education. Where I was learning in India, there was a school for children that was a big part of what was happening over there, and energy was put into the education of a lot of kids. You have a lot of other teachers that, through opening their heart and their care, have been really amazing environmental activists. So that has gone into the environment, or also into social work, just caring for others. So many people, even students, that have work in therapeutic relationships with other people, whether that's as nurses or doctors or social workers, and then or just grassroots activists. So I think just if you start to practice and you open your heart, you cut through what's not important, and it becomes much clearer what's important in life, which gives a lot of energy to pursue what we care about. So it's in a sense, it's fundamental to the path, is developing a care for something beyond yourself, to cutting through apathy and self-concern. And then that will be expressed very differently through different individuals. You know, that's expressed differently through how I work. Other people I was practicing with India are taking the teachings and working in Palestine, with people make for reconciliation across Israel and Palestine, doing a lot of work with the elderly, you know, here in Australia. I think some of the deep practices, inevitably when you practice, you start to feel more of the Indigenous traditions that have been here for so 80,000 years, 60 to 80,000 years, and wanting to make sure that how we practice here is online and in care with Indigenous traditions, and is in respect of that level of knowledge that is here on this ground. So I think it is a natural response if you are practicing diligently.
Thank you.
Yeah. The other thing too is we start to see, as we get more sensitive to the way where we are constricted through in our own psyche, you know, in our own psychology, in our own being, and we start to break through that and orientate ourselves into more of a dignity or freedom, which again takes time. You want that for other people. You start seeing through the social constructions or the prejudices or the views of the day that can really that you start to really see the nature of privilege. Like, you have to practice will start looking at everything. So you then really want everybody to be able to have access to that feeling of dignity that I think is a human right that the practices will point towards. Okay, well, I mean, only my own. I could just practice is ongoing, you know, and it moves. We develop, and then we sometimes take some steps back, and we have to again deepen our mindfulness and deepen those practices of care and compassion and understanding of impermanence, that what we're experiencing now is going to pass. I mean, that's ongoing, to be able to handle hardships around us, the losses of loved ones, everything like this. You know, practice it's a lifetime affair, yet there is delineated moments where we can really see progression. And I remember as a young person, struggling at that time through certain experiences that I had that were very hard and confronting. The result is that I had a lot of anxiety for a period in my own mind, but I had a very deep instinct that this didn't have to define me, and it wasn't something I would necessarily always live with. I had an instinct that there was a deeper place in my mind that had resource to work with this. And I remember very much, there was an intention of me. I really want to know what peace is, and I really do want to know how to work with suffering in a wise way, where you're not just going off and having a drink or working too hard or all the other ways we deal with our own unrest. And so through practicing for a long time, I remember at some point really feeling a deep sense of peace again that was hard won. And it was quite astonishing to see that, all of that application had resulted in me feeling a lot more at ease in my own being. So that's just something that came to mind when I was looking at those questions, Amy. A palpable feeling of that, of like, wow, I'm really now, I have a lot more space in my own mind. That agitation isn't there so much. A lot more confidence in my own mind, in my capacity to meet what's difficult. Then that's my own. Then another example, I was teaching a retreat. This is probably 15 years ago now. In India, it was a 6-week retreat. And there was a woman on that retreat, young woman. And as we start to practice the calm abiding practices I spoke about earlier, where we are starting to breathe and to settle, inevitably what arises is all of where we're not at ease. We start to really see, as our mindfulness begins, we start to see the patterns of mind that can be very painful. And she was really seeing the level of self-harassment. And I think many people know about this, but the internal critic and the harshness inside. And we ended up, she'd say, okay, Jess, is it okay if when I have one of, we started to call them hindrances, attacks, when I'm getting attacked internally by this, can I just come and talk to you? And so she'd have to come and she'd have to sort of verify with me, okay, this is what my mind's saying, that I cannot do this. I'll never be able to have this peace, that I'm no good, that I'm what in so many other ones I don't need to mention here that I can imagine you might be able to imagine, all the ways that we tie ourselves up in knots, that I'm not lovable, that I'm whatever. And she'd come and say, is this true? And I say, well, let's investigate, and we'd end up going, no, that is not a true thought. That's a thought which is having a very strong impact on the being. It would bring the heart would start to rise, the feeling of internal oppression, of heaviness would come. And we just kept saying, no, the thought would come. Is that true? No, that's not true. Is that true? That's not true. And applying kindness to, at some point, she in the middle of one practice session, when we were having a Q&A, and we were asking, people, what is your experience of yourself right now? And she almost shouted out, and previously she'd been very quiet, very meek, withdrawn. She shouted out, now I feel I'm a transparent mountain. Nothing can bother me. I am rooted in my own wellness and regard. And so what her experience was happening then, that all of those thoughts that would usually wind her up in knots, that would often lead to a whole lot of other thoughts of proliferation of mind going down kind of darker alleyways, had just stopped. They would come in, and she wasn't identifying with them. She'd grown that space. She wasn't impacted by what had impacted her for years of her life, and started to feel the energy and the well-being and the confidence. So I just remember that, her shouting out, I'm a transparent mountain. And it was just a very clear seeing of working with that pattern of self-harassment, seeing a growing beyond something that she'd originally identified with as within her identity, to see that actually wasn't part of her identity. Her identity was much bigger than that pattern of self-attack. I think there are, and I think there are a lot to do with the context in which we practice now, that is a different context to when the teachings were first given 2,500 years ago. Whilst a lot in terms of what we work with as a human being, heartbreak and loss and questions around what is the right livelihood for us, stress. Anyway, there's a lot, of course, that's the same in the human situation, but we're also living in a time where we have so much input coming at us. Like I've said this before and heard it said that in one day we'll have more input that someone 200 years ago had in their whole life. We have like so much distractions vying for our attention, and also the lifestyles where often many of us are working so hard there isn't as much time given to rest and replenishment. So I think both of these things have meant that we've seen the rise of so many stress-related illnesses. And so I think some of the modifications that I've seen would be that we need a lot more kindness in practices. I think like a real orientation to compassion is happening, just to help with that settling of the mind. Also, I think we need a lot of time of the practices that also do just to support the quality of rest, to let these, our own sometimes overworked bodies know what it is to actually know what rest is in the system. So in traditions that I worked with in India, that sometimes we would encourage a lot of lying down. And that was very different, but that was because everybody was so fatigued. And also because sometimes the Western mind strives, we want to know things quickly. We use a particular kind of effort that is kind of frontal and with our brain, but in a contemplative practice, we're really learning a different kind of mode of knowing, of being able to rest back, of being able to relax, of having the whole body engaged in our questioning. So yeah, that's all something that I think that we need to support a lot more now. The other thing I think is that with the climate crisis, a lot of, in my tradition, there has been emphasis on practicing on country and reconnection to nature, and that being a real support for our practice, to feel close to not just buildings and electric lights, but to be in more natural environments. It's how the Buddha first taught, and I think that is very conducive to practice. Our practice isn't dependent on that by any means. We practice in a lot of urban environments, but it is supported by that. So I think that's a really important focus. And then, I'd also just say that I think teachers in a modern context having more understanding of psychology, I think that is a really wonderful Western contribution, that sometimes on the meditation cushion, issues will arise that won't be addressed through meditation. And I think that that's really good for teachers to know when they're working with students, so that you could see what's happening in a student and think, actually, what I think is needed now is a therapeutic approach, where you need to really work with somebody else much more closely to work on what's arising in your practice, which will then help you come back into your practice and to help it deepen and expand and will really be more fostered. Because, that sort of working hand in hand with sometimes with a psychological approach, I think that's a modification. You'll get a lot of Dharma teachers that are psychologists or psychiatrists even, and I think that's added actually to the Dharma. So, and how do we do that whilst also conserving that the understandings in the Dharma that these methods are wanting us to understand, that is different also to a psychological realm. That's also really important. So working with the context, working with the sort of sometimes the agitation of these times due to what we're up against with climate change and a whole other lot of areas that can be, that are concerning and I think really do impact us.